California, once the Golden State, now just a mere shadow of its former glorious self. How times have changed. Businesses are now packing up, tent cities are breeding faster than Starbucks, crime's through the roof, and now the state's anti-2A brigade just fired off another round of legislative stupidity. The state's AG claims microstamping is now viable, officially greasing the wheels for SB 452 to lurch forward. Really now. So why is it that no one makes, no one buys, and no one with a functioning brain says it actually works? In this video, we'll talk about how California's so-called semi-auto ban is no longer some distant hypothetical. It's locked onto a legal timeline and could erase your ability to buy a modern handgun off the shelf by 2028. We'll look at what the DOJ just published, what the law actually says, and how the state plans to engineer a false sense of progress while banning your rights by attrition. There are the failed lab tests they're pretending are successful, the real-world stories that show how traceability already works and how it's already abused, and the political sleight of hand that's turned microstamping into the Second Amendment's latest Trojan horse. We'll also look at how other Marxist states like New York and DC are quietly lining up behind this scam, and why California's timeline matters more than ever. Stick around, because this is how they plan to kill retail gun sales without ever saying the word ban. California's Attorney General Rob Bonta just removed the last excuse for delay. His office published a report saying microstamping is now technologically viable, which flips the switch on SB 452's rollout and points the state straight at a dealer-level shutoff of non-microstamped semi-auto handguns on January 1, 2028. The report cites Penal Code Section 27-532 and spells it out plainly. Once DOJ decides the tech works, the mandate kicks in if the components or micro-stamping-enabled pistols are available at commercially reasonable prices or otherwise readily available. When SB 452 was debated in 2023, plenty of folks heard 2027 thrown around and assumed that was the doomsday. The statute actually hardwires two steps and a later sell ban date. Step 1 is the technological viability, finding due on or before March 1, 2025. Step 2 is a separate determination by July 1, 2027 that the parts or finished guns are available at commercially reasonable prices or readily available for purchase. If DOJ makes that second call, the dealer prohibition begins January 1, 2028. Bonta's office has now finished Step 1. Step 2 is still ahead, with an explicit July 1, 2027 deadline. That means the video claims flying around about an immediate ban jump the gun. The operative date in law remains January 1, 2028, contingent on that second finding. Here's the blade hidden in the handle. SB 452 is not the old roster game where legacy models limp along forever. Beginning January 1, 2028, if DOJ checks the availability box, a California dealer may not sell, transfer, or deliver any semi-auto pistol unless the pistol is certified micro-stamping enabled. That wipes out the functional path to stock and sell the very handguns Californians actually carry today. There are narrow carve-outs, inventory manufactured or delivered to the dealer before January 1, 2028, private party transfers processed through an FFL, and shipments for service or installation. But the normal retail channel for new semi-auto pistols becomes micro-stamp only. In short, it is engineered to be a de facto retail ban. If you're wondering why the roster suddenly started adding new models over the last 2 years, that's because the state lost in federal court on the prior micro-stamping mandate. In March 2023, Judge Cormac Carney enjoined the Unsafe Handgun Act provisions that demanded a chamber load indicator, a magazine disconnect, and microstamping for new editions, finding they violated the Second Amendment under Bruin. California appealed, but strategically did not challenge the piece enjoining microstamping, which is why new pistols began appearing again. SB 452 is Sacramento's do-over. They yanked microstamping out of the roster statute and rebuilt it as a separate, broader sales prohibition triggered by DOJ determinations. Bonta's new report leans on lab literature and a tiny in-house demonstration to say the tech works. He cites studies where examiners, under a microscope, could often reconstruct an identifying code from fired primers. His team then fired 10 rounds each from 2 pistols with microstamped firing pins and concluded the imprints provided sufficient information to narrow candidate guns. That's not field reality. That's a benchtop exercise with cooperative parts and a sample size that wouldn't pass a freshman stats class. But it gives the bureaucracy the checkbox it wanted. Step back and look at the commercial landscape. In 18 years of talking about this, not one major manufacturer has brought a production microstamping pistol to market for any jurisdiction, including places far more regulation-friendly than the United States. California tried to wish the technology into existence in 2007, claimed it was available in 2013, starved the roster for a decade, and still no one shipped a real product. The Reload summed it up. There still aren't any commercially available microstamping-equipped handguns, and there's no reason to expect gunmakers to retool on the say-so of one state. That's the point. SB 452 turns impossibility into policy. The law even directs DOJ to license microstamping component makers, publish performance standards, hand out grants or contracts by July 1, 2026 to jumpstart a cottage industry, and then decide by July 1, 2027 that the parts are on the shelf at commercially reasonable prices. The state is trying to manufacture a market to justify a ban that arrives right on schedule. If the parts never reach meaningful, affordable availability, the state can still say, "We tried," and the effect is the same. Dealers can't sell your next pistol. Let's talk about the tech itself, because this is where the sales pitch melts. Microstamping is supposed to laser engrave a microscopic code on a firing pin or other internal surface. When the gun fires, the primer gets struck and supposedly carries a legible code that examiners can read and link to a specific gun. In the clean world of brochures, each casing is a tidy business card. In the real world, primers are soft, guns cycle violently, soot and brass smear, and tiny engravings deform. The most substantive public testing, funded through California and run out of UC Davis, documented repeated problems, encoding structures that degraded under firing, Smith & Wesson dot codes that became illegible, radial barcodes flattened or obliterated by contact with the firing pin aperture in most pins tested, and alphanumeric marks that still varied in legibility. The study also showed how quickly a removed firing pin could be defaced with household tools. These are not quirks, they're failure modes. That same study ran thousands of rounds through CHP training pistols and still saw severe degradation on certain encoding formats. The authors concluded only the alphanumeric format offered potential identification, and even then, legibility depended on the specific firearm ammunition combination. They also noted that the gear and radial formats would require proprietary decoding methods from the vendor that weren't supplied. When the tech needs hand-holding, proprietary keys, and cherry-picking of casings to reconstruct a code, it's not a field-reliable solution. It's a lab hobby with policy ambitions. There's a reason the industry balked when California first flipped the switch in 2013. Then AG Kamala Harris certified that microstamping was available, unencumbered by patent restrictions, which triggered the old requirement and immediately choked off new handgun models. The number of approved models plunged over the next decade, and major companies publicly said they wouldn't comply. You don't need to be an engineer to read the room. If the people who actually build the guns think the mandate is unworkable or legally toxic, they're not going to spend millions, so Sacramento can claim a win. Supporters will say this helps solve crimes. That's a nice slogan. We already have NIBEAN, where law enforcement images spent casings and compares them to other evidence nationwide. We already have E-Trace at ATF's National Tracing Center, which walks a gun through manufacturer, distributor, dealer, and first retail purchaser records. Investigators can restore obliterated serials, test fire recovered guns, and link shootings by tool marks. Microstamping doesn't unlock a new universe of capability. It layers a fragile mark onto an already robust toolkit. And despite what TV scripts imply, the federal government is legally barred from maintaining a centralized, searchable registry of gun owners. The NTC literally plows through box after box of dealer records and faxes when it traces a gun. It's tedious, imperfect, and still effective. The claim that we can't solve crimes without microstamping collapses when you watch how cases are actually worked. If you want a human example of how aggressive this already gets without microstamping, consider the woman behind the Prepper University channel. She reported a stolen firearm around 2010, 20, and 11. For years afterward, she kept receiving letters, surprise calls, including a 2:30 a.m. phone call from a detective, and eventually a visit from the ATF, complete with the serial number in hand. She hadn't done anything wrong. She did what the law requires when a gun is stolen. That still turned into a long, exhausting stream of contacts. Now imagine adding a policy where any piece of salted brass with a readable mark points to your doorstep first, and you have to prove a negative. That's not smarter policing. That's building a suspicion engine. California also loves selective burdens. Under the old AB 1471 scheme, law enforcement agencies were exempt. The roster itself has long exempted many law enforcement purchases, allowing officers to buy off-roster guns civilians can't. SB 452's new Section 27533 sets its own rules and lists specific exceptions. It doesn't explicitly discuss sworn officer purchases in that section, but the state's broader roster exemptions for peace officers still exist in Penal Code Section 32,000 and related sections, and Sacramento's habit has been to insulate its own. I'd be delighted to be wrong and see every agency outfitted with microstamped sidearms if the state insists the tech is indispensable, but I wouldn't hold my breath. Proponents point to New York to claim momentum. After Bruin, the legislature passed a law in June 2022 directing the Division of Criminal Justice Services to evaluate microstamping's viability and build processes if certified. In other words, New York is standing where California stood for years, studying, announcing, promising. Meanwhile, the District of Columbia put a law on the books back in 2009 and then delayed implementation. The pattern is familiar because the technology and the market reality haven't changed. If you feel like you've heard the name Leland Yee in this conversation, you have. The former San Francisco state senator was a vocal microstamping booster and gun control advocate who later pleaded guilty in a federal case involving bribery and arms trafficking and received a 5-year sentence. The irony wrote itself then, and it still explains a lot about how these laws are sold. The loudest anti-gun voices rarely live under the rules they write. So where does that leave Californians right now? On July 28, 2025, the DOJ has declared the technology viable. By September 1, 2025, the department is supposed to publish performance standards for microstamping components. By January 1, 2026, it must start licensing component producers. By July 1, 2026, it's supposed to dangle grants or contracts to get those parts made and sold. By July 1, 2027, DOJ has to decide whether parts are available at commercially reasonable prices or whether microstamping-enabled handguns are readily available. If the department says yes on that last piece, the dealer prohibition activates January 1, 2028. That is the legal runway. Nothing in the DOJ's report touches what you already own. SB 452 is about sales by dealers after that date, not confiscation. It also does not shut down private party transfers. Those remain lawful through an FFL. But if you're counting on walking into a shop in 2028 and buying a modern, non-microstamped pistol off the shelf, the plan is to make that impossible. Expect constrained dealer inventory as 2028 approaches, price spikes on popular models, and a lot of legal activity. One more legal note matters. California lost the first round on the old microstamping mandate in Boland, and the state responded by moving the goalposts with SB 452. The Ninth Circuit has several related cases pending, and gun rights groups are already signaling renewed challenges. The longer the state insists on tech no one sells, the easier it is to show that the law burdens the core right to acquire common handguns under Bruin. That's why the statute includes a state-sponsored effort to conjure a market. If DOJ can point to a handful of licensed engravers and a trickle of parts, they'll claim the burden is minimal. That's the fight ahead. As for the claim that microstamping will finally give investigators the magic breadcrumb they've been missing, the UC Davis data says otherwise. Marks wear, marks smear. Ammunition and firearm combinations change legibility. A firing pin can be swapped or scuffed in seconds once removed. The state's own pass testing documented all of it. You could fire 20 rounds and still be piecing together partial characters. Meanwhile, criminals who already grind cereals and toss guns will keep doing criminal things, and compliant owners will carry the new liabilities. There's also the ugly practical twist. If brass at a scene points to you because you shot at a public range last weekend and someone pocketed your casings, you can find yourself explaining your life to retarded feds who think 2:30 a.m. is a great time to call. Sadly, that's all the time we have for today. If California declares parts or microstamped pistols available by July 2027, then come 20,028, dealers won't be allowed to sell anything else. That's not regulation, it's engineered extinction. But what do you think about this viability claim? If microstamping's so effective, why aren't police using it? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, share this with every gun owner you know, and subscribe with the bell icon so you don't miss what's next.